Be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. That's Ephesians 5, verses 1 and 2. And you know, they say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. I think there's a lot of truth to that. Through my years, my kids have imitated me a lot. I actually asked some friends of mine, tell me about some times when my kids have imitated me through the years. It's funny, it's natural for kids to imitate their parents, but it's funny the things everybody remembers about that, One of the less embarrassing responses I got was from someone who told me about a time years ago when my kids were in a church Christmas play, and apparently I had a role to play. This was when my kids were a little younger than they are now. My son Andrew was in this play, and I was Herod. And I only had a few lines, so I didn't go to a lot of practices, and I only sang one song. My song was called I Am Sincere. And apparently the purpose of my character was to be ridiculous. And I found out that when I wasn't at practice, my son would go and he would grab the hat and he would stick it on his head and he would stump around stage singing my song. Apparently it was quite cute. At least I was told about it over and over again. Your son is a little Pete, which I gather was supposed to be a compliment at the time. I'm not sure. And then in contrast to that, we have bacon bits. Bacon bits are also an imitation of perhaps the world's greatest food. At least comedian Jim Gaffigan thinks so. He likes to point out that even the frying of bacon sounds like applause. So what do we have to imitate bacon? Bacon bits. Have you ever eaten these? I'm not saying have you ever put them on salad or something else to sort of, try to make a fairy dust out of it. I'm saying, have you ever actually sat down and opened one of these up and just taken a big old fistful and stuffed them in your mouth? These are disgusting. I don't even know what's in I actually looked at the ingredients and I was like, okay, so let's see. Soy flour, canola oil, salt, caramel color, maltodextrin, things I can't pronounce. What is that? I don't know. That's kind of what the list is of these things. There are some imitations that are worth doing and are well done. And then there are bacon bits. And it got me to wondering, as we are called to be imitators of God as dearly loved children and to live a life of love as Christ loved it, us, as the world looks at the way we love one another, do we look like children imitating their parents faithfully and with adoration, or do we look like bacon bits? To a world that's desperately wondering whether we're serious about the things we say we believe. I thought about wearing that bacon suit today. I thought that might add a little spice to the message. But I love this passage in Ephesians chapter 5. Live a life of love. I love the way that Paul has taken the gospel and he's wrapped it in this tiny phrase and saying, you want to know how to be a follower of Jesus? Live a life of love. In his book, The Mark of a Christian, author Francis Schaeffer writes this tiny book. He's known for writing books that are just profound and deep, but in this one book, it's a very thin book, and in this one book, he expresses the sentiment behind what Jesus says in John 13 when he says, God gave to unbelievers the right to judge the authenticity of our faith by observing the love or lack of love we have for each other. By this, all men will know you are my disciples if you love one another. Do we look to the skeptical observer like people who really love each other in a spectacular, unusual way that is not typical of those who live in the world? And there's an important and powerful connection between the love we have for other people and the love we have for God. This is why John wrote in 1 John, anyone who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. Now, this connection isn't surprising given what Jesus said when he was once approached by a lawyer and asked, what's the most important command? And in Matthew chapter 22, he answers simply, love God. And then he goes on to say, and the second one is like, homoios, like it, love your neighbor. Now, what's surprising to me about this is not the connection between them. What is surprising to me is that Jesus gave permission to all men to judge whether we are really disciples of Jesus by seeing whether or not we love each other. Does that scare you at all? It should. It scares me. Why does it scare me? Because as I think back through the years at the people I have struggled most to love, they're Christians. In fact, the people that have been the most difficult for me to love through the years have actually been leaders in the church. When I have heard people preach through the years about the need to love your enemy, and I've been asked to identify who are the people who you would say are your enemies, those are the people that came to mind, leaders in God's church. Why does it make me nervous? It makes me nervous because the biggest reason missionaries leave the field isn't the difficulty of living in a foreign country. It isn't persecution from nationals or governments. It isn't sickness or disease. The biggest reason missionaries leave the field is conflict with other missionaries. We have a love problem. And this is the way all men will know whether you are my disciples, including the people you are going to serve, if you love one another. It makes me nervous because when I think about loving people, it seems very easy to me in theory. Like the idea of loving people is an easy idea for me to embrace. But when I consider what actually loving people is going to require of me, I find it a lot more difficult. I can really relate to Linus in his conversation here with his sister Lucy. You a doctor, Lucy says? Ha, that's a laugh. You could never be a doctor. You know why? Because you don't love mankind. That's why. And Linus responds, I love mankind. It's people I can't stand. And that's funny, but it's real. And for us who are in this room, who have given our lives to serve humanity, we might often find people very hard to love. And so live a life of love is a real challenge. This semester we are considering how God calls us to relate to one another. Depending on what version of Scripture you use and exactly how you count, there are somewhere around 60 one another statements in the New Testament. 60 specific things we are told to do for one another. By far, the thing we are told to do toward one another more than any other is love one another. Fully 1/4 of all the one another statements in the New Testament are love one another. Jesus is serious about this whole idea of us loving each other. And so as followers who wear his name, we need to take seriously the challenge of figuring out what obedience to this command ought to look like. And the thing is, most people are really comfortable with this phrase. If you go around and you say, you know what you really ought to do is live a life of love, most people would be like, okay, I can do that. That sounds great. Gallup's most recent poll, this was December of last year, showed that 76% of Americans identify themselves as Christians. 76%, over 3/4 of the people that live in this country say, yeah, I'm a Christian. Does the love we experience from the people we encounter, from over 3/4 of people we encounter in our country, suggest that's true? Is there a testimony to all men who see our love for one another that would compel them to take Jesus seriously? And the truth is, superficially, there isn't even anything distinctively Christian about living a life of love. But there are difficulties we face when we start taking this command seriously. At least 3 of them. I'm going to talk about 3 this morning. Number 1, the first difficulty in really loving one another is what Scripture really means by love. Loving one another is hard because the word love is used in so many different ways that it's come to mean almost everything in our culture, and consequently it means almost nothing. Greek uses at least 4 different words for love. English author C.S. Lewis, who's known for Chronicles of Narnia and is also known for Mere Christianity and many other books, wrote a book about this. You may have heard of it. It's called, interestingly enough, The 4 Loves. And he identified 4 common words that are used in the Greek language to describe love. Here they are, the Greek words, philos, eros, storge, and agape. The types of loves that are represented there are friendship love, romantic love, family love, and godly love. And C.S. Lewis uses his own labels there. He describes these as friendship, eros, affection, and charity. And much of what we often call love isn't agape. Agape love, which is the one that Jesus is telling us that we need to express to one another when he says love one another, is a willingness to give of ourselves to benefit the other person. When most people say they love someone, they're not often describing a decision of self-sacrifice, but a feeling. Our love is not primarily demonstrated in verbal statements when we feel emotionally attached to someone. Our love is demonstrated when we choose to act in another person's interest when we wouldn't otherwise do so. Our love is demonstrated when it costs my preferences, when it challenges my priorities. Our love is demonstrated not when we see what people can do for us, but when we ask ourselves, what can we do for those we love? How do I know when I have that kind of love for someone? When I agape someone, I do what's in their best interest, whether it's what I want to do or not. It's a love that does not say, I love you because, but rather it's a love that says, I love you even though. It's a nevertheless kind of love. And when I think about having to love other people like that, that's a challenge. When I think about loving people that way, even my close friends and my family are hard to love like that. But what really makes this kind of love challenging is that Jesus extends it way beyond that, because he says we are also to love the unlovable. That's a second challenge we face. When Jesus talked about us loving our neighbors and enemies in the Sermon on the Mount, you remember what he said? He calls out our inclination to love the lovable. He says, if you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? And he even challenges the way we express hospitality. He says, when you give a dinner or a banquet, don't invite your friends or your brothers or relatives or your rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. I find it fairly easy to love the lovable. And I think we do in the church. I remember when I was a youth minister, I remember feeling pretty comfortable saying we were a really loving youth group. We loved each other. And there was a lot of truth in that. We encouraged one another. We helped one another. When someone was down, we tried to do what we could to assist them. Like, we were a group of people who loved one another. But then all of that was challenged when a group of Gothic kids invaded our youth group, with what seemed like the express purpose of disrupting what was taking place within the context of our group. We didn't find out whether we really loved each other until our love was challenged by the necessity of loving people who were difficult to love. God's call for us to love one another is the beginning of establishing a culture of love that extends to those that we're going to find more challenging to love. And that leads me to the third thing that challenges us in our attempts to really love other people. And that is facing personal obstacles. There are some people in this room who want to love others, but find they simply cannot. And it isn't that they don't want to, it's that there's something that stands in their way. The capacity to truly love rises up from within a soul that is loved. This is why John writes, we love because what? He first loved us. When we do not know that we are loved ourselves, it becomes difficult, I would say impossible, to truly love other people. Deep in your soul, do you believe and know that God really loves you? Because until we really know that, we will never be able to truly love one another. We aren't able to give ourselves away until we are confident of who we truly are. We cannot give to others what we do not have ourselves. I love what John Chrysostom said. I love this guy, John Chrysostom. I don't know if you've ever read any of his sermons. This dude is amazing to me. You know what the people in his church called him? They called him Chrysostom. That means golden mouth. Like, how cool a preacher would I have to have been at my church for them to call me Peter Chrysostom? Yeah, that would have been awesome. They never did. But Chrysostom said this. He said, not all children imitate their fathers, but those who know themselves to be loved act like beloved children. Some people's experiences have crippled their capacity to love. Some of you will have experiences that will cripple your capacity to love. When that happens, and you hear a message like this, and you desperately want to love others, but you find that you are empty and dry and you have nothing to give, then the right next step for you is not to try harder. It's not to beat yourself up. It's to pursue good self-care. To do what is necessary to care for your soul, to allow God to nurture your heart so that you can get to the place where you are again capable of loving others. The statement, love your neighbor as yourself, is predicated on the understanding that you love yourself and you see yourself as loved. So if you find that this is where you are, either now or in the future, here are just a couple quick pieces of advice. Number one, pursue greater personal intimacy with God. If you find yourself dry and empty and feeling unloved, then you're probably not spending enough time with the Lord. And even though it seems incredibly difficult, even though nothing in you has that longing, spend the time with Him anyway. And pursue a greater level of personal intimacy with the Father, that He can find a way that will speak to your soul, that will speak intimacy and love and passion once again into your life. Number two, begin the process of forgiving those who have deeply wounded you. One of the biggest reasons why we find it terribly difficult to love is that we have been so deeply hurt. And the process of forgiveness is often one that cannot be simply made. You can't sometimes, depending on how deep the wounds are that you've experienced, you can't just decide, okay, I'll forgive them and move on. A lot of times there's a process that you need to go through, and whatever stage you are in that process, I encourage you to take the next step. And a third thing that I would encourage you to do is to process your hurt with others. Consider counseling as an option if your hurts are at that level. Because we are called to live a life of love. This is not a command to go out and do something today and make it all better. It's rather a command to become a different kind of person. Becoming a person of love, a person whose love overflows out of their lives into the lives of others. It requires a conscious decision to fight our instinct towards selfishness. We know we love others, particularly when an opportunity presents itself to love that we never expected, that we never saw coming. Jesus described this when He talked about the Samaritan, who going along the road saw someone who had been beaten by robbers and left there bleeding on the side of the road. And He uses an example of this is what the love of neighbors really looks like. When an opportunity presents itself to us and we are ready in the moment to love, that's when we have begun to really obey His command. I found one illustration of this last October. On October 11th last year, there were a group of young women who were running in the cross-country championship race in Glendon, Minnesota. This was the last race of the year. Students from a lot of different schools were there, and they were running the race. And one young woman named Danielle Lanoux from Fargo South High School was running the race, and she found herself almost within sight of the finish line, less than half a mile, when she felt a pop in her left knee and she went down to the ground. She had torn her patella tendon and her meniscus, and she lay there in a heap on the trail as other runners continued to run by. Until one young woman, interestingly enough, from a different high school, named Melanie Bailey, stopped to help Danielle up. She tried to help her up and put her arm around her, and the two of them walked to the finish line. And then she found she wasn't capable of walking. And so Melanie bent down and she picked Danielle up and carried her on her back to the finish line. Melanie later expressed her gratitude for this help, saying, "You know, she didn't have to do that. How many people just ran past me? And she stopped." When asked about it later, here's what Melanie said. "You know, it's just a race. That's the thing. A person is forever. A race just lasts 25 minutes." I don't know if Melanie Bailey is a follower of Jesus or not. But when I read this story, it reminded me of Jesus talking about that Samaritan who stopped. We don't know when an opportunity will come to stop and love others. And we're so busy and so preoccupied with our agendas and our schedules and all the things that we think that we have to do that there's no margin or space. And love requires space in our lives to be able to extend to other people. When that opportunity comes our way, May we learn to love like Jesus, who would hear somebody calling from the road, who would notice the man sitting in the tree. And let us imitate him and the way he loves. Let us live a life of love, because the last thing the world needs is more bacon bits.